Right now, somewhere not far from you, someone is lighting up. Maybe in a parked car, maybe on a balcony after a long shift. Maybe it's legal where they are, maybe it isn't, but the smell is unmistakable, and it has become so ordinary that we barely notice it anymore. A plant. Set on fire. Breathed in on purpose. And you've probably never stopped to ask the strange question hiding inside that little ritual. Who did this first? Not last year. Not in the 1960s. The very first human being who took this one specific plant, decided to set it alight, and leaned in to catch the smoke, who were they? Where were they standing? And what, exactly, were they trying to do? The answer is older than the alphabet. Older than most of the gods people still pray to. And for almost the entire story, getting high was never the point. So let's go back to the beginning, to the plant itself. Cannabis did not come from a dispensary. It came from the cold, high country of Central Asia, up near the Tibetan Plateau, where the wild ancestor of every joint, every edible, and every length of rope on Earth first grew on its own. In 2021, a large genetic study traced the plant's domestication to East Asia around 12,000 years ago. Sit with that number for a moment. 12,000 years. That is roughly the same window in which humans first planted grain, first settled into villages, first invented farming at all. Cannabis wasn't a late guest at the party of civilization. It was there when the doors opened. And 12,000 years is almost impossible to feel, so try it this way. If you lined up every generation between that first cultivated plant and you grandparent to their grandparent, all the way back you'd need something like 500 people standing in a row. 500 handshakes back through time, and this plant is at the very front of the line, already in human hands. It has been with us longer than almost anything you'd call civilization. But here is the first thing almost nobody expects. Those earliest growers were not chasing a high. They were after rope. And dinner. For thousands of years, this plant was one of the most useful things a human being could own, and none of it had anything to do with your head. The stalks gave long, strong fibers hemp that could be twisted into cord, woven into cloth, knotted into nets and fishing lines. Some of the oldest pottery ever found in East Asia is pressed with the marks of hemp cord, which means people were making rope from this plant before they were making written words. And the seeds were food, oily, dense with calories, easy to store through a brutal winter. So picture what cannabis actually was to your distant ancestors. Not a party, a hardware store, and a pantry, growing in a field. So when does it change? When does somebody stop weaving it and start burning it? For that, we have to walk into a graveyard in western China. In the Turpan Basin, one of the driest, hottest places on the planet, so bone dry that it mummifies whatever you bury there, archaeologists opened a grave in a cemetery called the Yanghai Tombs. It was roughly 2,700 years old. Inside lay a man from a people known as the Gushi, buried with the trappings of someone who mattered, and laid over his body were nearly 800 grams of cannabis. Not seeds this time, not fiber. The flowering parts of the plant, the parts that actually carry the punch. Because that desert air preserved it so perfectly, researchers, led by the scientist Ethan Russo, were able to test it thousands of years later and confirm it still contained threek, the very compound people are chasing tonight. This man had been sent into the afterlife with a personal stash, and everything about the burial suggests he wasn't a rope maker or a farmer. He was something closer to a shaman. That's the turn. That's the moment the plant stops being a tool and becomes a doorway. But the clearest evidence, the actual smoking gun, if you'll forgive it, comes from a little further west, high up where the air thins out, and it's worth slowing down for. In the Pamir Mountains, at a burial site called the Rudenko Cemetery, archaeologists found something that reads almost like a frozen scene. Wooden braziers, small burners, still holding stones that had been heated until they cracked from the fire, and baked into the residue on those stones was the chemical fingerprint of burned cannabis, carrying unusually high levels of cannabinol, the marker left behind when EC-rich plant matter goes up in smoke. This was around 2,500 years ago. A team led by the researcher Meng Ren published the find in 2019, and their conclusion was striking. These people weren't burning just any cannabis they happened to find. The wild plant that grows on its own is fairly weak, but these mourners appear to have sought out the strong stuff plants that, whether through altitude, cultivation, or luck, packed far more of a psychoactive kick. They had a preference. They knew the difference. They went looking for the good batch. And it matters that this was happening in the Pamirs. These mountains sat astride the early corridors of exchange that would later feed into the Silk Road, the arteries along which goods, people, and ideas crossed the whole of Asia. So this wasn't some isolated local quirk. It was sitting on a highway. A taste for burning strong cannabis had every route it needed to travel outward, from one people to the next, carried on the same paths as silk and salt and everything else worth moving. And notice where this is happening. Not at a feast, not at a marketplace, at a funeral, around the dead. Picture it for a second. Thin, cold mountain air, a ring of people. Hot stones hissing inside a carved wooden bowl, music maybe, and smoke curling upward in a place built entirely for the departed. The first unmistakable evidence we have of human beings smoking cannabis for its effect is not a good time. It's a ritual to reach the other side. Which brings us to the man who wrote it all down. Around the 5th century BC, the Greek historian Herodotus described a people called the Scythians, fierce, tattooed, horse-riding nomads who ruled the vast grasslands of the Eurasian steppe. He wrote that after a burial, they would set up small tents, throw cannabis onto red-hot stones inside, and breathe the vapor that boiled off. And according to Herodotus, they would howl and shout with sheer joy at the pleasure of it. For a long time, historians weren't sure whether to believe him. It sounded like a traveler's tall tale. Then the archaeologists caught up with him. In the frozen burial mounds of the Altai Mountains, the Pazyryk tombs, excavated by Sergei Rudenko, the permafrost had preserved the proof. They found a small set of sticks arranged into the frame of a little tent, and a censer of stones with the charred remains of cannabis. It matched what Herodotus described almost exactly, right down to the tent and the hot stones. A written page from ancient Greece and a chemical residue frozen in Siberian ice, separated by thousands of miles, both pointing at the very same cloud of smoke. Now here's the part that reframes the whole story. As cannabis spread out of the steppe and into the wider world, it did not spread as a party drug. It spread as something sacred. Travel to an ancient shrine at a place called Tel Arad, in what is now Israel. On a small altar dating to the 8th century BCE, researchers in 2020 found preserved residue, and it tested positive for cannabis, apparently burned as an offering inside a place of worship connected to the kingdom of Judah. People were placing this plant on an altar and letting the smoke rise, right alongside frankincense as a way of reaching toward God. And far to the east, in India, one of the oldest sacred texts of all, the Atharva Veda, lists cannabis among a small handful of holy. Protective plants said to release anxiety. From the Pamir funerals to a Judahite altar to the hymns of ancient India, the pattern is the same. This was not recreation. This was reverence. Smoke used as a bridge to the dead and to the divine. And that's the thing worth truly stopping on. For the overwhelming majority of the time humans and this plant have shared, the high was not casual. It was rare, it was ceremonial, and it was aimed squarely at the biggest questions people had: death, the spirit, the world beyond the one you can see. Think about why smoke specifically. You can eat this plant, but smoke rises. Smoke goes up, toward the sky, toward wherever the gods and the ancestors were thought to live. Burning it wasn't just how they consumed it. It looked like exactly what they believed it did. Now, an honest word, because this is where it gets slippery. Pinning down the exact first time is genuinely hard. Smoke leaves almost nothing behind. Plant matter rots. What survives to be dug up thousands of years later is a tiny lucky fraction of everything that once existed. So when we point to a grave in Turpin or a brazier in the Pamirs and call it the earliest, what we honestly mean is the earliest we've managed to find. The true first time was almost certainly older, quieter, and lost forever some person, some fire, some accidental lungful of smoke that nobody recorded and no residue preserved. We're reading the last few surviving pages of a much longer book. But the shape of the story is clear, and it's far stranger than the modern version lets on. Cannabis walked beside humanity for 12,000 years, first as rope and food useful, ordinary, boring, Then, somewhere on the high cold roof of Asia, people discovered that a certain kind of it, burned and breathed, could reach in and change the inside of your skull. And when they found that out, they did not treat it as a toy. They carried it to their funerals. They set it on their altars. They used it to speak to whatever they believed was waiting on the far side of the smoke. So think back to that person near you tonight, lighting up on a balcony without a second thought. What they're doing is almost unimaginably old. The plant in their hand descends from the same lineage as Scythian, once tossed onto glowing stones 25 centuries ago, the same kind of smoke a mountain community breathed over their dead in the thin Pamir air. The gesture is nearly identical. Fire, plant, breath, that slow lean into the rising cloud. The only thing that has really changed is what we think it's for. They reached for the smoke to touch something sacred. We reach for it to take the edge off a Tuesday. Same plant, same fire, same ancient, stubbornly human urge to feel, just for a little while, like the ordinary world isn't the only one there is.